Hi, I'm Dr. James Bylund. I'm a licensed educational psychologist and licensed clinical psychologist, and I'm the owner and director of the Bylund Clinic.
Hi, my name is Danielle Morales. I'm a licensed educational psychologist and the clinical co-director of the Bylund Clinic. And today we're getting together to talk all about IEEs. So what is an IEE, who should get one, and why parents are requesting them, among other topics. So James, to start us off, can you provide a definition of what is an IEE?
Yeah, so an IEE is an independent educational evaluation, and it's basically a second opinion assessment. So one of the procedural rights that parents hold when their child's evaluated for special education by the school district is they have a right to request a second opinion assessment. And we're going to dive into all sorts of reasons why that might be. But again, it's one of the parents' procedural rights, and it's a request for somebody who's independent of the school district, who's not employed by the school district, like the Bylund Clinic, to come in and conduct an evaluation when the parent again disagrees with some aspect of the school district's evaluation.
Okay. And if parents are listening to this and wondering if they should get an IEE for their child, what are circumstances that you would recommend that people request one?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I'm not an advocate for every single parent runs out and requests a second opinion evaluation, from the school district. But there are times when a parent might feel that it's necessary. So again, the right to request is based on a parent's disagreeing with the school district evaluation. Now, it could be the evaluation itself, and I can talk about what some of those reasons might be. But it could also be uh, disagreement with some other sort of outcome that's based on the assessment, right? So, the assessment is really sort of the foundation of which IEP eligibility is determined. It's the foundation of identifying a child's needs and subsequent IEP goals. And it's really the driver of what those services would look like. So, there's lots of reasons why a parent might disagree with the evaluation itself, right? So, one, just right off the bat, these assessments are just incredibly difficult for somebody who is not a school psychologist or neuropsychologist to even understand, right? So, sometimes parents are requesting these because the assessment really didn't make any sense. The recommendation around eligibility didn't seem to make a lot of sense, or the recommendations around services that came out of that assessment didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. So that's perhaps one reason. I think a major factor is, the assessment report is coming back with conclusions and recommendations that just don't match a parent's lived experience, right? So, a parent may be, firsthand observing the challenges that their child is experiencing, and the school district assessment comes back and, suggests that, maybe some of those challenges don't exist, or they're not as, significant enough to warrant services. So, those are certainly reasons why. Sometimes the school district evaluation is just not complete. Maybe they didn't really thoroughly assess in all areas of what they call suspected disability. So maybe they looked at possible learning disability, but didn't look at the possibility of how the child's ADHD might be impacting them educationally. So maybe the assessment just wasn't complete enough, right? Uh, you know. Uh, Along those lines, parents might disagree with the outcome around whether or not the child is eligible for services. So the school district says they don't meet the eligibility criteria, and again, that doesn't make sense to the parent because they're observing their child to have more significant difficulties in school that they believe warrant services. Now, sometimes it's farther down the road. So the parents. Sort of the statute of limitations on requesting one of these assessments is 2 years. So maybe when the evaluation is completed, it seems to make sense, and there's no major disagreement around the recommendations or services that come out of it. But maybe a year later or 18 months later, the child's not really making the anticipated progress on IEP goals, for example, and now there's some disagreement around whether or not the service recommendations were appropriate or all of the goals were appropriate. And because those were based on the assessment, the parent might consider, hey, do we really need a second opinion assessment? Because what sort of the recommendations that came out of the first one haven't been terribly helpful. So, I think there's a lot of different reasons why a parent might request one, and those are certainly some common ones.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful framing. And I think it's helpful to think about that it could be one of two issues. There's kind of two buckets, right? Like one is concerns about the quality of the assessment itself. And then the other bucket, it sounds like, are concerns around the way an IEP is actually drawn up or implemented, or how the child is or isn't responding to services within the IEP. Now, I have a question that comes up, I know, a lot during intake calls and meeting with clients that I think would be good to touch base on. And that is some of the subjectivity and layers of nuance around special education eligibility. So,
Mhm.
for example, a lot of parents, who don't have a background in education or psychology may not be aware, for example, that there's three different ways to look at a learning disability, for example. So can you
Yeah.
talk through, how different models of specific learning disability identification, for example, although that may seem relatively abstract or, very deep in the kind of bureaucratic layers, can really have a very real impact on a final decision that an IEP team is making and how that can impact the identification of the child?
Yeah, and it really sort of gets at sort of the crossroads of that we face, right? Which is really in between, our work as psychologists, conducting, neuropsychological and psychoeducational evaluations from sort of a clinical perspective, and the intersection between that and special education regulations. And in all honesty, I mean, it's really important that, the assessor sort of understands those things. Special education regulations are long and complex, and oftentimes, there's a lot of room for debate, and it's the source of a lot of contention between school districts and families when we're trying to figure out what services a child really does require. Right now, it might seem pretty straightforward on the surface, like does a child have a specific learning disability or not? But the California regulations on determining eligibility, what the eligibility requirements are for specific learning disability, is about 2 pages long. And it describes a number of different ways of potentially determining whether or not a specific learning disability exists. So it does get sort of complicated, and try to think here what the most straightforward way to explain this is. But the primary way that schools in California determine whether or not a child qualifies for services due to a specific learning disability is what they call like the discrepancy model. And so here, what we're essentially looking at is there a significant difference between the child's age and intellectual ability and their achievement in reading, writing, or math? And this is largely determined by standardized tests. Now, it can't be determined, the regulations are clear. It cannot be determined by a single test or set of tests. So it has to be supported by other information, right? So it can't just be test scores, but that's primarily what the school districts are looking at. They'll administer what's essentially an IQ test and take a look at what that number is. And then they'll administer achievement tests of reading, writing, and math. And they'll take a look at what those scores look like. And then they'll do a fairly straightforward calculation, of whether or not there's a significant enough difference between those test scores, between their IQ score and what their achievement score is. And they call that the discrepancy model. But when you look at the California regulations, they go beyond that, right? And in fact, and I'm paraphrasing here, and certainly I'm not an attorney, right? But it goes beyond that and says, essentially whether or not a discrepancy exists, a child can still be found eligible under these additional criteria, right? So it is very possible. In fact, the regulations say you should be considering this, whether or not they have a severe discrepancy. You can be found eligible based on what they call like inadequate achievement models, right? And there's two models for looking at that. One of them is what they call response to intervention. So, has the child, failed to respond to regular education interventions in such a way that it would indicate the presence of a learning disability, right? So, we've pulled them aside for reading intervention and we've tracked their data and they're just not responding in the way that we would anticipate. And that's in all likelihood due to a specific learning disability. The type of interventions and supports that they're going to require are more long-term, not just short-term intervention. So that's one way of taking a look at it. And the other is what they call a pattern of strengths and weaknesses. So it's essentially a pattern of strengths and weaknesses in the child's achievement, performance, or both, relative to their age, relative to state grade level standards, or intellectual ability. And there's different models that schools have adopted for taking a look at that, but uh, but the regulations don't define it any further than that. So essentially they're saying like, hey, whether or not there's a severe discrepancy, if there's a pattern in the test scores, as well as their school performance that would be indicative of a learning disability, they could still be found eligible, under that specific learning disability category. So
Mhm.
I feel like it's so confusing every time I try to I try to explain that. Believe me, what I just said is much simpler than what's in the regulations, but that's essentially what it's getting at.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the framing because I think it does a good job of starting to break down the layers of the complexity. So I know one of the great frustrations that I hear when I'm speaking with clients and parents is a statement such as, well, they said they weren't discrepant. But again, going back to some of your earlier pieces around that may not make a lot of sense, where, well, this score looks discrepant from this score. And so really understanding that there are these regulations and there are these laws, but there is so much nuance and expertise and training that goes into filtering all of the data that we're gathering, whether that be through standardized scores or historical information and report cards and work samples that then should inform that ultimate eligibility discussion, as well as knowledge of all of these different regulations and ways that eligibility can be considered. So I think
Yeah.
it's good to start framing it and the complexity therein and why it's so important to get that second opinion sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. And a couple things on that point too. Like, um, as parents, there's just no way that you would know that. Like
Mhm,
there's just no way, right? Um, Frankly, I'm a clinical psychologist, but that really leans heavily into my license as an educational psychologist, which is why the rest of our team of assessors are all educational psychologists, because it's not enough just to know, how to clinically diagnose a learning disability, at least not when you're doing these IEEs, right? Like you have to understand what the regulations are. So that's hugely important when you're doing these assessments. The other thing along that point too is there's all these sort of like rules of thumb that like districts will just sort of throw out there that have absolutely nothing to do with the regulations. And frankly, I said parents would never know this. The rest of your IEP team doesn't know this either. I mean, a lot of issues that I find with IEP teams, and I'm probably hopefully not going too far in saying this, is a lot of the school district members of the team don't really know what's in the regulations, right? So they're sort of making these decisions based on sort of what's historically been done, or sort of these quote unquote rules of thumb that they're functioning by without really sort of understanding what the law actually states.
mhm,
And I think when you're doing this outside of assessment, it's important to be able to do a high quality assessment of the child's learning needs, but it's also really important to be able to frame that within the regulations and help explain those to not only to the parents, but the rest of the IEP team. Because you hear these things like, oh, they're not 2 grade levels below. Parents will say, well, the district said they're not 2 grade levels below, so they're not even going to assess, right? Well, there's nowhere in the regulations around eligibility that defines that as being 2 grade levels below.
mhm, mhm,
And then an even bigger issue with that is it prevents schools oftentimes from even conducting assessments at an age where we can actually intervene and make a big difference,
mhm,
right? So one of the things I've heard for years is the parent of a kindergartner or first grader says, hey, I think my child might have a learning disability. And the district's response is, well, they're not going to be found eligible because they're not going to be 2 grade levels below. We have to wait until third grade to determine that. Well, if you're looking at dyslexia, you've missed a major developmental window between the ages of 5 and 8 years old when you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck with intervention. So it's absolutely ludicrous to wait to do that assessment. You can absolutely determine whether or not a child has dyslexia in kindergarten and first grade and start providing the necessary interventions that are going to make the biggest difference. Because again, even the school district personnel don't even really know what's in the regulations. They say this whole thing about 2 grade levels below doesn't exist anywhere.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that emphasizes the importance of that independent second, objective outside opinion. I mean, I know having worked myself across a couple different states, a couple different districts, that a lot of times what's being implemented on the ground is a district's interpretation of the law based on their SELPA, based on their attorneys, based on their program specialists' read of the regulations. And things kind of get filtered down. And then communicated back, as you're saying, as these steadfast rules or, requirements, wherein it's really the same people at some point in the chain going back, reading those regulations, and then coming up with their interpretation, with the caveat being also there's the protection of resources aspects and
Yeah,
different
yeah,
complexities with the bureaucratic funding and these things, right?
for
And so
sure.
having somebody that can kind of go back to the basics and say, let's just look at the law, let's just look at the options, let's look at the data, and is outside of that system is a really important part of the IEE process too.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
you touched on something that I think is also important to unpack, and a question that, again, I get a lot is, will this result in a diagnosis, right? So when parents are seeking an IEE, a lot of times they've heard at this point a couple times, well, my child has a learning disability in reading. But it's not clearly defined, for example, if that is a disability in dyslexia
Mm,
or reading comprehension or maybe language processing that's spilling over into reading.
yeah.
So, can you talk through a little bit how differential diagnosis plays into IEEs and how that's then coupled with that recommendation for special education eligibility? Because I think a lot of times those things are couched as separate by
Yeah.
districts of, oh, well, we don't really work with the diagnoses, but there are really educationally important facets that come from an accurate medical diagnosis of a condition.
Yeah, and that sort of takes me back to the earlier question too around why do parents seek an IEE? I think there's a lot of confusion that districts create. Not the district's fault, right? I mean, school psychologists are credentialed by the California teacher credentialing. So they're credentialed to make recommendations around eligibility. They're not licensed to diagnose, and that's not their fault. That's just the way it is. But it does create a lot of confusion because they're making these recommendations for special education eligibility based on what are clinical diagnoses, right? So, ADHD, for example, or a learning disorder like dyslexia, and then the parent is trying to understand, right, rightfully, so what is it? Do they have ADHD? Do they have dyslexia? And they get this runaround because they can't legally answer the question because they're not licensed to diagnose. So then we get these referrals because parents are like, they're saying they've got this specific learning disability. I think it's dyslexia, but the school district won't say whether it's dyslexia, and so it does create quite a bit of confusion. I think the other sort of really relevant piece around it, treatment wise, is we have a lot of research on how to treat these specific conditions. So if we're saying if we're not being really specific about it being dyslexia, then that does create some question marks around whether or not we're addressing it appropriately, right? So uh, so and it kind of ties in with our work as assessors and what sort of differentiates different assessors, frankly, too. Um, some LEPs out there might not feel comfortable making a diagnosis because of their lack of experience in that area. They've spent their whole lives as school psychologists and then maybe do some IEs on the side or something like that. There might be some clinical psychologists that frankly don't understand the regulations. I think one of the nice things about our practice is we really do bring those two worlds together. So when we're doing our assessment, we absolutely make clinical diagnoses. I think those are extremely important in understanding what exactly is going on with the child and how we're going to go about treating it. It's very important in my mind that that's part of the evaluation, and we're certainly able to do that, right? And then we also then take a look at how does that fit into special education eligibility criteria. So, we might diagnose a child with dyslexia, even sort of, identify what the underlying areas of neuropsychological processing are that are contributing to that dyslexia. That'll help us better understand how we're gonna treat this condition, through educational interventions. And then we'll also then take a look at, the special education regulations around their eligibility criteria. So yes, they qualify under the specific learning disability category. But now we know it's because of dyslexia, and because we know it's dyslexia, we've got a ton of research, to inform us on how we should go about treating that. And that treatment then goes to, okay, what are our IP goals going to be? What is that special education service going to look like? So that we're getting the best use of those resources and the time that we're spending with that child.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. Yeah. And I think outside of dyslexia, another common thing we see come up are broad terms like an attention processing disorder, right? And so attention can be impacted by so many factors. Is it socio-emotional, right? Is a child struggling with anxiety that's impacting their attention? Is
Yeah,
it secondary to their learning disability because they're just so fatigued from having to work so hard to keep up in reading, writing, and
right.
math throughout the day that, their attention is kind of suffering on the back end? Or is it an attention processing disorder like ADHD? And so I think for many of these more educationally related conditions, really getting into the nitty gritty is really important because, as you're saying, we respond differently, based on what the actual presenting condition that's underpinning the educational need is.
Yeah.
So, if parents at this point are thinking, this sounds great, right? I need this level of nuance. I need this level of unpacking to really understand my child. How do they find an IEE assessor? And how do they go about requesting an IEE for their child?
Yeah, no, really good question. And just real quick too, sort of dovetailing on what you just shared as well. That is one of the issues sometimes with the school assessment, is they might give, like, say, a rating scale that asks parents and teachers questions, and then based on that rating scale, we see these elevated scores for attention, for example, and they go, oh, they've got attention issues. Well, those scores can be elevated for a lot of different reasons, like you said, and simply doing the rating scale alone really isn't enough to understand why that could be. Like you said, anxiety, could cause significant difficulties with concentration. And if we're calling it, sort of attention processing, or sort of like, sort of alluding to the fact that it's ADHD when it's not ADHD, we're not going to be addressing it appropriately, right? And that's one of the things with our assessment. And again, looking not only at the eligibility criteria, but looking at the clinical diagnostic criteria, is we're digging down below the numbers. We're not just saying, oh, this rating scale came up really high for attention. We're unpacking that and saying, okay, why was that? What items were endorsed? What additional sort of direct testing can we do to verify that
Mhm,
that's the case?
mhm.
And so we're going to get a much clearer picture in terms of whether or not those attention difficulties, again, are related to ADHD, or is it anxiety? Is it depression? Is it related to their learning disability? And a lot of times with the school district assessment alone, it's not always clear, you know?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so kind of coming back to this question too around, if a parent thinks, an IEE is necessary, how do they pick assessor? How do they go about making that request, right? So, um, I suppose let's start with making the request. All that's legally required is that you request an independent educational evaluation. It has to be in writing, but an email should be sufficient. You're going to want to direct it to somebody who knows what it is that you're requesting. So at the school site, I would address that email to, if the child's already in special education, that would include their case manager. If they have just been assessed and not found eligible, I still might include that person who ran the IEP meeting. It's usually like the school's resource teacher. I would include the school site principal on it, although they don't always know understand the special education regulations. It's just, as the administrator for that school site, you should probably just include them in it. I think it's going to be really important, though, that you include the school psychologist. They're probably the one at the school site that understands special education regulations the best. Like they're going to know what an IE is. Depending on the school, it's very possible that the school site principal, or the resource teacher don't even know what that is. So some schools are going to be very familiar with it. Some schools aren't, right? So you're going to want to include the school psychologist. And then I would include somebody from the district, in the special education department. And that's going to depend on the district, because depending on the size of the district, there's varying levels of administration, right? But somebody that you might want to include, or somebody like what they call like a program specialist, or a program director, especially if that program specialist or director is assigned to your child's school site. If you can figure that out online, that would be a really good person to include. And then above them would be like a special education director, that you can include as well too. Um, But I do think it's important to include people at the school site because they're the ones that are working directly with your child, but also include the district personnel because the program specialist and district director absolutely know what an independent educational evaluation is, and they know what you're requesting, and that's all going to be processed through the district office. So the uh, consent forms and contracts with the outside assessor, that's not done at the school site. That's done at the district office. So you're going to want to include that. But again, all you have to say is, I am requesting an independent educational evaluation for my child, and might want to include, their name, birthday at school, whatever. So clearly identify who it is. Districts might ask, well, why are you requesting it? There's no reason to not share that information. I mean, if you want to, but there's nothing in the regulations that requires you to. So don't feel obligated that you have to have this really nuanced response in terms of what it is that you're requesting. Frankly, I think for most parents, it's not. There's sort of some sense that the assessment missed the mark, but they may not know how to necessarily articulate that, to the district. But they don't need to. Right? They could say, I just disagreed with the assessment, and the district can't sort of delay their response to the parent's request because the parent hasn't specified the exact reasons why. So I just want parents to understand that they may ask that, but you don't have to have an answer ready for them. You don't even have to answer the question at all, right? As far as selecting an assessor, it's fairly common that districts or SELPAs, that's the special education local plan area. So some of these smaller districts are part of these larger organizations that sort of oversee special education services. But they might have a list of assessors, right? And they say, okay, you want an IE, here's our list of assessors. What they do not tell you is you do not have to pick somebody from the list. Okay. Now we're on a lot of lists. So I'm not knocking the list. We're on a lot of lists, right? But I think sometimes parents are not told that they can go outside of that list, right? And they can select any assessor they want so long as they meet certain criteria. So there might be criteria around the person's license, are they a licensed educational psychologist, for example? They might have some cost containment, right, where the district says we'll pay up to this amount. But that's not up to the parent to figure out. That's up to the assessor in the district to negotiate. And then they might have some requirements around geographic location, right? The district doesn't want to have to pay for a family to fly across the country to get the assessment. They're going to say, okay, it's got to be somebody that's reasonably local, So there are some sort of requirements that the district has, but so long as your assessor that you find meets those requirements, and our clinic meets every one of them, right? Certainly for families living in the greater Bay Area, Northern California, right? So because of the geographic location. So, they have to meet those requirements, but again, you don't have to pick somebody from the list, one of the things I hear a lot of times from families, there's some, concern around, are the people from the list truly independent, or are they really just an extension of the district, right? So one of the things that I would want to know if I was a parent is whether or not that psychologist does contract assessments for that school district or other school districts. So there's a lot of LEPs out there that sort of do some IEs on the side, but really their primary job is contracting with school districts. They're an independent contractor. They do the district assessments, right? In my mind, that does create a conflict of interest because they're supposed to be. It's supposed to be an assessor that's not employed by the district. The regulations don't specify whether that's a W-2 employee or a 1099 employee. But in my mind, if you're doing district assessments, you are employed by the school district, and it just invariably creates a conflict of interest because now this person that's supposed to be completely independent has a relationship with the school district, and if they say anything that might not sit well with the school district, they may reasonably fear that their other contract might disappear. And so that's one of the things that we ensure is we do private evaluations, we do independent educational evaluations. We don't have any ongoing contracts with districts to do school evaluations because it just inherently creates a conflict of interest. And our focus is on the kid, and that's unwavering. And we're going to make recommendations that are in the best interest of that child, not in the best interest of whether or not our contract with the district is continued.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. Yeah, I think the dual relationship piece is kind of tricky for parents to navigate because it's so behind the scenes,
Yeah,
but it's a good one to elevate. I think for our last question to close out this discussion, a question that comes up a lot is when to get an advocate or an attorney involved in the
yeah,
IEE process. So I think it would be helpful to talk through what is the intersection of, the psychologist work doing the IEE with the advocacy and legal world. When might you just need the IEE? And when should you get an attorney or an advocate involved? And at what
yeah.
point during that process might you start seeing some flags to let you know that it's time to start that search if you don't have a partner already working with you in advocacy or law?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really important question. And you're seeing more and more parents coming to IEP meetings with, advocates or attorneys. And um, yeah, I wish it didn't need to be that way, to be honest with you. I wish people didn't need to get these outside second opinions. I mean, my dream is that, kids go to school and they get the help that they need regardless. Is but unfortunately, this is sort of the system that we live in. Um, you know that I certainly think there's times when you might need an IEE, but you don't need an advocate or attorney. You know, um, I think uh, there's certainly times when um, in particular when the team really works well together. Um, the school teams being very upfront and transparent about things. You feel like they certainly have your child's best interest in mind. Now, there may be times when you feel the teacher has your child's best interest in mind and you still need an advocate and an attorney. But these are some situations where the team's really working collaboratively. You can get the outside assessment and the team is receptive to the additional information that's being provided. They're open to taking that new information and updating the IEP. So maybe there's a disagreement on eligibility, and with the additional information, they're like, oh no, now we see it. We do see that they meet the eligibility criteria, and they move on and provide services. You might not need an advocate or an attorney, right? Or they make other updates to the IEP around necessary goals and services, right? So if the team is really working well together and things are transparent, you feel like you have a clear understanding in terms of the process and how decisions are being made. You might not need an advocate or an attorney. I think there's a lot of times when they can be very helpful, though. The regulations are extremely complicated. It'd be a full-time job for a parent on top of the jobs that they already have to try to learn what these regulations are in order to be able to effectively advocate for their child's needs. So having somebody that understands what the regulations are, can explain them to you, can really walk through all the IEP paperwork and explain what it contains, what needs to be added, how to interpret all of that information. That can be really useful. Parents go into IEP meetings and they're handed stacks and stacks of paperwork that are all written in a foreign language. And having an advocate to be able to translate all of that so that it makes sense, it can be really super helpful. Beyond just having somebody there to help you sort of navigate through this really complicated world of special education, there are times when maybe there's a sense that the school district isn't being as transparent as they should be, or maybe they're not as receptive to parent input or input from an outside assessor. And it may be helpful at times to have somebody that can not only sort of explain things to you as a parent, but knows what the questions you need to ask during the IEP meeting are, can ask the really tough questions that may be difficult as a parent to ask in an IEP meeting. Can really sort of push back on the district when there's a sense that they're not being transparent or collaborative. And advocates and attorneys can do a lot of behind the scenes work. Certainly there's the IEP team meetings and discussions, but when you have an advocate or an attorney working with you, they're also meeting separately outside the IEP team with the district director, for example, or an attorney may be meeting with the school district's attorney to be able to negotiate things and help move things forward, even beyond the IEP meetings themselves. And so I certainly think there's I'm a big fan of honestly special education advocates and attorneys. I think they provide a tremendous service to families, to again be able to help understand this process and to be able to navigate it, and ensure their children are getting the necessary services. Now, that again, just like I said, not every school district assessment requires an IEE. And not every parent is going to need an advocate or an attorney. But they certainly can provide some really they're a valuable resource. At times when parents need help.
Yeah, yeah. I appreciate you walking through all that. I think the things that I would add are whenever a parent is interested in something like compensatory minutes,
Yeah, sure.
unilateral placement, so whenever there's a financial consideration at play, I always recommend that clients retain representation.
Yeah.
I think that sometimes parents have a really good-hearted assumption that, if the needs are clear, the district will come to the table and recognize that the child needs a unilateral placement, for example, or, meaning they need to go to a private school or an NPS. And unfortunately, sometimes that's not always, the way that things play out. And sometimes parties are not seeing eye to eye, potentially, or especially rather when there are financial considerations at play. And I
Yeah,
think.
no, thank you for bringing that up, because that's absolutely is going to be needed. I've uh, have a family I've worked with for years and continue to work on right now. And with right now we're gonna do an updated assessment. But that's exactly what their experience was, right? So they went into the situation. The original assessment was just privately funded. They came to me and asked for an assessment. We did it. Was successful in getting the district to move forward with eligibility. And the families are rightfully, it's like, they like the school staff, they want to give them every opportunity in this to be able to appropriately service their child. But then there was just sort of systemic things that went wrong, right? So, the resource teachers, went on leave and they couldn't fill the position, for example, right? And so now there's this child going on for an extended period of time, either with no teacher providing the services or somebody without sufficient training providing the services, and they miss like a whole year of intervention, right, at a really critical juncture. And so that you brought this idea of like compensatory services. Well, so their advocate then went to the district and said, hey, you failed to implement the IEP. Like the IEP said they were going to get X number of minutes, and they never got it, And so now they said, okay, well, we're going to request now that district that you back fund and provide and pay for us to go out and get these services because you're not able to provide it. That's an example of something that an advocate is going to be able to do, and a parent's going to have a very hard time doing that on their own.
Mhm.
And it may require an attorney, but in this case, it was as an advocate. Now, this issues continued to the point at which they said, hey, we can't continue here. We're going to need some outside placement because the district has shown that they're unable to provide the necessary services, right? And so now they're looking at a private school that can provide, that has the resources to provide what the district should have been providing for the last 2 years. And now it's sort of elevated. They have an attorney that's helping them do that, right? Super nice family, really like and respect, the school staff, but the district just flat out wasn't able to provide what the child needed. In order for the family to now get what the child needed, because the district has an obligation, like a free, appropriate public education. Child requires an appropriate public education at no cost. And so it may require an advocate or an attorney to ensure that the child's getting what they need, and the district is providing it, whether they're providing it with their own personnel or they're funding some other program or service to provide it.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Any
thank you for bringing that
other,
up.
of course, yeah. Any other closing comments or things that we haven't talked about for IEEs that you think are important for parents to know, especially if this is their first time hearing about them and, again, they're curious about learning more?
Oh man, it's such a big topic. I think we covered certainly a lot of the basics. Again, I want to reiterate, I don't think this means that every child that's ever been assessed requires well, actually, that does bring up a point here too. So when can you request an IEE? Again, I don't think that every child needs an IEE for every assessment that the school district has ever done. I absolutely don't think that. I mean, but there are times when one is legitimately necessary. And again, the parent has the right to request it. So a couple, I guess, things that we didn't touch on is when parents can request an IEE anytime the school district completes an evaluation. So we do them for psychoeducational evaluations, but the same would hold true for a speech and language evaluation. The same thing would be true for an occupational therapy evaluation. The same would be true for what they call functional behavioral assessment, which we actually do those too, right? But so that anytime the school district does a special education evaluation, it doesn't just have to be the psychoeducational evaluation. So I would say that is an important thing to note. And gosh, something else came to mind, and then it just floated away. Oh gosh. Yeah. So again, anytime the school district does an evaluation, you're able to you can, oh, that's what I was gonna say. You can request it. Now when you request it, there's only 2 responses that the district can provide. There's no like legal time frame for how long it takes them to respond, although they have to respond without any undue delay. And so there's been lots of different court cases that said, well, at what point is it an undue delay? And for an IE, that's probably sits around 45 days, based on case law. So it might take them a little while to respond, but there's only 2 responses that they're allowed to have, right? They can either say yes, we're going to go ahead and fund it, or they're going to have to respond with some type of prior written notice, stating the reasons why they're going to refuse to fund it. Most districts are going to fund it, most of the time. Because their only alternative then is to go in front of a judge and defend their assessment. And they don't know how the judge is going to hear that, and the judge may just end up ordering the district to do the evaluation anyway. So frankly, it's easier for the district to just fund it in many cases than to fight it. But those are really their 2 options in responding. And the parent has the right to request. It doesn't guarantee that you get it, but you have the right to request, and most requests are honored.
Okay. Thanks for walking through those additional 2 points. So if parents are listening to this and they are in the California area, broader Bay Area, and they say, yes, this is exactly what we've been looking for, my kid definitely needs an IEE, where can they find the clinic's information and how can they book an IEE with the Bylund Clinic?
Yeah, for sure. So just by going to our website, which is the bylundclinic.com, Bylund spelled Bylund, so the bylundclinic.com. And there they can submit an inquiry form, requesting, information about an IEE, which, we would then follow up with. And then there's a number of steps involved in the IE process. But, the first step would be to reach out to our clinic to request an IE, and then simultaneously, reaching out to the school district and making that formal request in writing.
Well, it's great talking with you this morning, James.
Yeah, thanks, Danielle.
Sign off.
All right.